Respect is free, but some people believe their money gives them the right to deny it to others. The evening unfolded like any high-stakes business dinner, polished and professional, but beneath the surface, something wasn't quite right. Jamal Carter sat confidently at the table, a tall, well-groomed black man in a sharp, tailored blue suit that spoke of success. His demeanor exuded calm assurance, the result of years of hard work and discipline. He was here for more than just a meal. Tonight, he was closing a deal that could change the trajectory of his career, setting the stage for his next big leap. The upscale restaurant, La Maison, with its gleaming silverware and white-gloved waitstaff, oozed an air of exclusivity. Conversations hummed quietly, accompanied by the faint sound of wine glasses clinking. Yet the atmosphere was thick with unspoken judgments. It was a world where wealth and status ruled, and Jamal knew this all too well. Across the room, a woman with sharp features and cold blue eyes sat in the middle of the crowd. Victoria Hastings was every bit the image of wealth and privilege. Dressed in a designer dress that draped over her like an expensive piece of art, she radiated a sense of superiority that came from a lifetime of entitlement. Her life had been one of luxury, a world where money erased any sense of limits, where the idea of being judged or looked down upon simply didn't exist. People like her never had to wonder if they were truly seen as equals. But tonight, that very world of entitlement was about to collide with Jamal, and it was going to shake her assumptions to the core. Victoria's gaze moved over the restaurant, taking in the room with an air of casual superiority, her eyes eventually landing on Jamal. The briefest flicker of surprise passed over her face, but she quickly masked it with a sharp, assessing look. She couldn't quite place him, but something about him didn't belong in a space like this. This was her world. She tilted her head slightly as if scrutinizing him, though she quickly returned her attention to her conversation. There was something about his presence, though, that tugged at her perception. He didn't fit the mold of someone who should be here, in this prestigious establishment at this table. The brief interaction had been enough for her to decide he wasn't a peer in her eyes, though she wouldn't voice it just yet. In her world, people like Jamal, people of color, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, had no place in these circles. But she would soon learn how wrong she was. Meanwhile, Jamal remained focused on the task at hand. The evening's business meeting was crucial for his future. He had worked tirelessly to get to this point, putting in countless hours to prove his worth. His suit, his calmness, and the quiet determination in his eyes all spoke volumes. He knew exactly how to carry himself in such environments. He had learned to navigate this world of wealth and exclusivity carefully, but with precision. His success hadn't been handed to him. It had been earned, fought for, every step of the way. As he spoke with the executives across the table, discussing terms and conditions, he could feel Victoria's gaze on him. It wasn't a gaze of admiration or curiosity, but something more piercing, almost condescending. He ignored it at first, focusing on the conversation at hand. But the longer she watched him, the more aware he became of the subtle tension building between them. For Jamal, this dinner wasn't just a professional engagement. It was a battle for respect. People like Victoria, with their unchecked privilege, were often the ones who tried to diminish his accomplishments, as if his presence in such spaces was an anomaly. But tonight, he wasn't just going to let that judgment slide. He had worked too hard to be dismissed. The tension hung in the air, thick and electric, as Jamal's voice grew more confident. He was closing the deal, and in doing so, he was making a statement not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong in a world defined by wealth and power. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Drop a comment below. Jamal had been quietly waiting for his business partner, his phone in hand as he reviewed some important documents. The elegant hum of the restaurant surrounded him, the clink of silverware, the soft murmur of conversations, the rhythmic shuffle of waitstaff moving through the room. He was focused, steady, not looking for trouble, but always ready to deal with whatever came his way. Then the waiter approached. His face was pale, clearly nervous. "Sir, there's been a complaint," he stammered. Jamal raised an eyebrow, glancing up from his phone. A complaint? About what? Before the waiter could respond, a sharp, cutting voice rang out across the restaurant, slicing through the air like a dagger. "You don't belong here!" Victoria Hastings spat from her seat. Jamal froze. Her words hung in the air, cold and biting. He knew he wasn't imagining it. The entire restaurant was now focused on him. Heads turned, eyes shifting, the noise dropping to a stunned hush. "People like you ruin places like this." Her voice was loud and filled with venom, each word wrapped in contempt. Jamal's stomach tightened, his chest constricted. He had been here before, in situations where the weight of prejudice bore down on him. He had worked harder than anyone to get to this point, to be in this restaurant with these people. But to Victoria Hastings, none of that mattered. To her, he was nothing more than a symbol of what she couldn't control. He could feel the tension in his muscles as his heart started to race. His mind screamed at him to hold it together, but the sting of her words hit too deep. Her eyes narrowed at him, full of disgust as she looked him up and down. Her lip curled in contempt as she looked at him, as if he were the dirt beneath her designer heels. It wasn't just a glance. It was a dismissal, a rejection of his very existence. Jamal clenched his jaw, trying to stay calm. He had earned his place at the table, fought for every step he'd taken in life. But none of that mattered now. Victoria had made up her mind about him, and nothing was going to change that. "Get out, Black," she sneered. The words hung in the air, more potent than any slap could have been. Jamal's hands tightened around his phone as the heat rushed to his chest. The sting of injustice burned like fire, but he refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. He had faced worse. This was just another hurdle to overcome, another insult to bear. He opened his mouth, ready to speak, to stand up for himself. But before he could utter a word, something unexpected happened. The slap landed across his face with the force of a freight train. Victoria's hand collided with his cheek, the sharpness of her slap cutting through the air, and the shock in the room. For a moment, everything stopped. Jamal's face burned, not just from the pain of the slap, but from the sheer humiliation. He could feel his pulse in his temples, hear his heartbeat in his ears, and for a second, the room seemed to spin. He stood there, stunned. Everyone was watching, silent, as if frozen in time. The waiter stood motionless, unable to move. The other patrons unsure of what to do or say. Jamal, still processing the slap, felt the weight of the entire room on him. He had worked so hard to be here, and in a single moment he had been reduced to nothing. The heat in his chest flared again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just anger. It was the familiar feeling of being made to feel small by someone who believed their privilege gave them the right to belittle others. He had faced this kind of treatment before, but it never got easier. His hands shook slightly, his chest tight with the flood of emotions. But in that instant, something inside him shifted. He didn't move, didn't flinch. He stared at her, making sure she knew he wasn't backing down. He wasn't going to let her or anyone else define his worth. The room was still silent. Every eye was on him, and in that silence, he stood tall. His eyes locked onto Victoria's, unwavering. "You're wrong," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions roiling inside him. "You don't get to decide who belongs here." Victoria's smug expression faltered for a split second before she quickly masked it with a sneer. But it was too late. The truth was out there now, and Jamal had made his statement. She could do nothing but stand there as the room now witnessed something far more powerful than any insult. His dignity. The silence lingered for a moment longer before the murmur of whispers began to grow. Some patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others simply stared at Jamal, unsure of what to do. The power dynamics had shifted, and the line between who belonged and who didn't had been erased in the space of a few words. The waiter, recovering from the shock, approached carefully, not knowing whether to apologize or offer something to smooth things over. Jamal just shook his head. He had been slapped. He had been humiliated. But in that moment, he understood something important. His worth wasn't determined by the opinions of people like Victoria Hastings. He had always known that. But now, more than ever, it was clear. Jamal stood up straight, adjusting his jacket. His business meeting had just taken an unexpected turn, but he would not be shaken. He turned to face the other patrons of the restaurant, his voice steady and calm as he spoke once more. "I belong here, and so do you. Have you ever faced discrimination? Share your experience in the comments. We want to hear from you." The sharp sound of the slap still rang in the air, a loud reminder of what had just occurred. Jamal's face stung, but he didn't react the way Victoria Hastings had expected him to. There was no flinch, no anger rising in his chest, just a calm that spread over him like armor. His jaw clenched tightly, and his fist instinctively tightened at his side. The impulse to lash out was there, deep down, but he forced it back, refusing to let her see the anger she so desperately wanted to provoke. No, he wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Victoria, standing in front of him, seemed to expect him to crumble, to apologize, to look away, to leave in shame. She smirked, as if certain that her wealth, her privilege, had just won the battle. But Jamal Carter wasn't that man. He stood tall, his shoulders squared. The fire in his chest remained, but it was controlled. He wasn't going to be moved by her arrogance or her attempt to degrade him. He straightened his jacket, his movements deliberate, steady. Every eye in the room was still on him, watching, waiting to see what he would do next. Victoria's smirk didn't waver as she crossed her arms, eyes narrowing at him. She seemed to think she'd already won. After all, she had slapped him in front of everyone. But Jamal wasn't fazed by her presence or the weight of the situation. He had been through worse. He had seen far too many people like her dismiss him, underestimate him, and try to break him. And every time he stood his ground. With a calmness that could be mistaken for indifference, Jamal locked eyes with her. He stared her down, his gaze unwavering. No one else in the room dared to speak, unsure of how to respond, how to break the tense silence. Then, in a voice that carried through the room like a calm storm, Jamal spoke. His words were deliberate, his tone measured and firm. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The weight of the statement hung in the air. Victoria's smirk faltered slightly, her eyes narrowing even further. She had expected him to cower, to flee from her disdain, but Jamal's words had the opposite effect. They weren't words of anger or retaliation. They were words of truth, words that carried power. The silence stretched on as the tension in the room deepened. The once noisy restaurant had become a backdrop to something far more important. Something that was unfolding between Jamal and Victoria. His words weren't just a statement, they were a challenge. They were a reminder that people like her couldn't just act with impunity. Her wealth, her power, didn't give her the right to degrade someone, to put them down, to pretend that she could decide who belonged in a place like this. Jamal stood there, not backing down. And as he did, something shifted. The room, which had once been filled with uncomfortable glances and hushed whispers, now seemed to focus entirely on him. The other patrons were watching intently, some out of shock, some out of disbelief. They were witnessing something they hadn't expected. A black man, a street kid, standing tall and unafraid in the face of someone with far more power and privilege. Victoria's expression shifted, just slightly. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes flashing with a mixture of surprise and frustration. She wasn't used to being challenged. She wasn't used to being looked at like this. But Jamal wasn't intimidated by her. He wasn't looking for her approval. He didn't need her to validate him. "I belong here," Jamal said quietly, the weight of his words settling in the space between them. His voice was steady, unwavering. "And so do you." The room seemed to hold its breath. The quiet after the storm was palpable. Victoria took a step back, her confident posture faltering. The patrons around them were now whispering amongst themselves, some nodding, some looking away. No one had expected this. No one had expected Jamal to stand up like this, with this much strength, this much dignity, in the face of someone who had tried to tear him down. Jamal didn't wait for a response from Victoria. He didn't need one. He knew what he had just done. He had made a statement, not just to her, but to everyone in that room. He had reclaimed his dignity. He had forced people to see him, not as a stereotype, not as an invisible figure on the streets, but as a person worthy of respect. As Jamal turned to walk away, he could feel the eyes of the restaurant on him. But he didn't care. He had already said what needed to be said. He had already proven that his presence here, in this moment, mattered. The silence in the restaurant remained as Jamal walked out of the room, leaving behind the uncomfortable tension and the people who had witnessed his courage. What would they do with it? That was up to them. But Jamal had already made his decision. He wasn't invisible anymore. Would you have stood up for yourself? Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Drop a comment below. The air in the restaurant shifted immediately. Victoria's face twisted with surprise, her lips parting slightly as she turned toward the man who had just spoken. The entire room held its collective breath, as if everyone instinctively knew that something significant was unfolding right in front of them. Richard Belmont, the owner of La Maison, stood tall at the entrance of the restaurant. His presence seemed to fill the entire space, even as he simply stood there, still and unyielding. His gray hair was neatly combed, his charcoal suit immaculate. He was the type of man whose wealth and influence had earned him respect, and no one dared to challenge that until now. Victoria, still seated, looked up at him, her smirk slowly disappearing. For a moment she looked confused, as if she couldn't believe someone would dare speak to her like this. but Richard's words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. "Touch him, and you'll lose your job." It was simple, director, uncompromising. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but her voice faltered. She wasn't used to being spoken to like this. She wasn't used to being questioned, especially by someone who wasn't as rich, as powerful, as influential as she was. She glanced around the room as if looking for someone to support her, but no one moved. The other diners, some still frozen in their seats, remained silent. Richard stepped forward, never breaking eye contact with Victoria. His gaze was calm, but there was a firmness to it that made everyone in the room understand that he was not someone to be trifled with. He was used to power. He was used to people listening to him. "Victoria," he said, his voice low and steady, "I don't care what your family name is or what influence you think you have. In this restaurant, you will treat everyone with respect. Everyone. No exceptions." Victoria's cheeks flushed crimson. She stood up quickly, but her voice trembled as she tried to gather her composure. "Richard, this is absurd," she stammered, her arrogance slipping through her feigned calm. "You can't possibly expect me to—" "I do expect it, Victoria," Richard interrupted, his tone hardening. "You've crossed a line, and you'll have to answer for it." Jamal, still standing off to the side, felt the tension in the room. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. For the first time, someone was standing up to Victoria, not just for him, but for the principle of treating others with dignity and respect. Victoria's shoulders sagged slightly, her pride shattered. The facade of superiority she had worn so easily was now crumbling. Richard's words had made it clear. Her wealth and status meant nothing here. In this moment, in this restaurant, her behavior had been called out, and there was no escaping it. "I'm sorry, Richard," Victoria muttered, the words barely leaving her lips as she sat back down. Her eyes darted to the other diners, who were now watching her with a mixture of curiosity and quiet judgment. Richard didn't acknowledge her apology. Instead, his attention turned back to Jamal. "I believe you've earned a seat at this table," he said, his voice warm, his demeanor shifting from stern to almost inviting. He walked over to Jamal, who had been standing quietly through the whole exchange, his heart still racing from the confrontation. "Sir, Jamal began, but Richard held up a hand, cutting him off. "No need for formalities," Richard said with a slight smile. "What you did today wasn't just brave. It was necessary." Jamal stood there, stunned. He had never expected this. A man like Richard Belmont, the owner of one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, saying such things to him, a stranger, a black boy from the streets. It didn't make sense. He had been treated like an invisible figure for so long, and now here he was, standing before someone who saw him, who recognized his worth. Richard gestured to an empty seat at a nearby table. "Come, sit with me. You've earned the right to be here." Jamal hesitated for a moment. He glanced at the seat, then at the other diners who were still watching him, some with curiosity, others with approval. But in that moment, something inside him shifted. He straightened up, his shoulders less burdened, and walked toward the table. Victoria remained seated, her gaze directed at the floor, still processing what had just happened. She had lost the battle without even realizing it. Her arrogance had cost her the respect of everyone in the room, and she knew it. Richard pulled out the chair for Jamal, gesturing for him to sit. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on Jamal. He had been shown respect when he'd least expected it, and in that respect, he had proven something far more valuable than wealth or privilege: his dignity. Jamal sat down, his hands steadying themselves on the table. He looked up at Richard, who had already turned his attention back to the menu. The restaurant buzzed with nervous energy, the patrons whispering and looking around, some still unsure of what exactly had happened. They'd all witnessed the scene unfold, but no one had expected the outcome. Jamal's refusal to react with anger or violence was a statement in itself. He had shown grace, dignity, and strength, qualities Victoria Hastings had clearly lacked in her own actions. The power dynamics in this room had shifted in ways he couldn't quite understand. But for the first time in his life, Jamal felt like he had a place here. The lesson was clear. Respect was not something that could be bought or dictated. It was something that had to be earned, and Jamal had earned it with every action he'd taken. Would you have stood up for yourself? Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Drop a comment below. Victoria's smile, once sharp and self-assured, melted into a look of disbelief as Richard's words sank in. Her eyes widened, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She was caught in a moment of stunned silence. Richard, unfazed, continued, his voice low and measured. "You didn't just insult Jamal," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "You insulted me. And more importantly, you insulted this restaurant and everything it represents." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze now intense. "You think your wealth and privilege give you the right to treat people like trash? You're wrong." The room was still. The other diners, who had been watching the scene unfold, now held their breath, waiting for the next move. Jamal, who had been standing by quietly, finally took a seat. The power dynamics had shifted. No longer was he the invisible man, dismissed and ignored. He was in control now. And so was Richard. Victoria's face turned crimson. She stammered, trying to find the words to defend herself, but there was no excuse for her behavior, no justification for her actions. I didn't mean," she began, but her words faltered. Richard didn't let her finish. "Save it," he said, the words cold and final. "You've made your choice, and now you'll face the consequences." The entire room seemed to hold its breath as the gravity of the situation settled in. Jamal's calmness was striking. He had seen the worst of people, had lived with it for most of his life. But now, in this moment, everything was different. The tables had turned, and the woman who had so arrogantly tried to diminish him now found herself at his mercy. Richard glanced over at Jamal. "You've earned this, Jamal. You've shown me what true integrity looks like, what true respect looks like. And it's not just about money, it's about character." Jamal nodded slowly, processing the words. He had always known his worth. But here, in this moment, in the company of those who had once thought less of him, he felt something deeper, a sense of validation that went beyond the material. It wasn't just about owning a restaurant now, it was about owning his place in the world. Victoria, now completely disoriented, stood up shakily. Her eyes darted around the room, unsure of where to turn. She had made a grave mistake, a mistake that might cost her everything. Her gaze fell on Jamal again, but this time it was different. Gone was the arrogance, gone was the contempt. What remained was a mixture of fear and regret. Richard looked back at her, his tone unwavering. "You'll leave now, and you'll do so quietly." His words held the finality of a decision made. Victoria's wealth, her reputation, none of it could shield her now. She had overplayed her hand. Without another word, she turned and hurried out of the restaurant, her head down, her heels clicking against the polished floor. The door closed behind her with a resounding finality. The room, once thick with tension, now felt lighter. The diners began to murmur among themselves, some still in disbelief, others whispering to one another. But Jamal remained silent, watching as the events unfolded. Richard leaned back in his chair and looked at Jamal, his expression softening. "You're a man of integrity, Jamal. That's why I've put my trust in you." Jamal's mind raced. The weight of what had just transpired was sinking in. He had come into this restaurant just looking for a meal, maybe a chance at a new deal. But in that brief moment, he had gained something far greater: respect, power, and a chance to reshape his future. "Thank you," Jamal said quietly, finally breaking his silence, "for believing in me." Richard smiled, a glint of approval in his eyes. "You don't need to thank me. You've earned it." Jamal sat back in his chair, absorbing everything that had just happened. The arrogant woman, who had once seen him as beneath her, was now gone. And Jamal, the young man from the streets, was now in control of his own destiny. The future was uncertain, but in that moment, Jamal knew he had just rewritten the rules. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving. Jamal sat back in his chair, a slight smirk playing on his lips as he sipped his drink, the ice cubes clinking faintly against the glass. Victoria's shocked expression lingered in his mind, but he didn't let it faze him. He had already made his decision. No matter how much she had humiliated him, he wasn't going to stoop to her level. He didn't need to engage in petty revenge. What he'd done had already proven far more effective. As Jamal stood to leave, he felt the weight of the eyes upon him. But this time, they weren't filled with judgment or disdain. They were filled with respect. Jamal was no longer invisible, no longer the other. In that moment, he knew he had changed the game. The next morning, Victoria Hastings's name was splashed across every headline in the city. The story spread like wildfire, and within hours, her face was all over the news. The headlines were unforgiving. Prominent socialite banned from exclusive restaurant after racially charged attack. The articles covered her behavior in detail, her haughty demeanor, the slap, the disgusting words. And then came the fallout. She was no longer the revered socialite she once was. Her reputation, carefully built over years, was torn apart in an instant. The socialite who had once held so much power in her world had now become a cautionary tale for anyone who thought they could abuse their privilege without consequences. Jamal didn't have to ruin her. She had done it herself. The following day, Jamal returned to La Maison. As he walked through the door, the staff greeted him with smiles, and patrons nodded in respect. They had all seen the news. Jamal had become a symbol of dignity, a man who'd stood up to power and won, not by force, but by sheer will, by holding true to his integrity in a world that so often sought to tear it down. As Jamal walked through the restaurant, he noticed the change in the air. The atmosphere was different. The usual whispers and sidelong glances had been replaced by admiration and acknowledgement. People were finally seeing him, truly seeing him for the first time. And the best part, he wasn't asking for it. He wasn't demanding anyone's approval. It had been earned. For the first time in his life, Jamal Carter didn't just have a seat at the table. He owned it. And as he settled into a seat at the far end of the room, looking out at the elegant dining hall, Jamal knew one thing for sure. His life would never be the same. No longer would he be dismissed, overlooked, or humiliated. He was a force to be reckoned with now. not because of his wealth, not because of his power, but because of the strength of his character, the thing no one could take from him. Jamal's eyes flicked to the window, watching the sunlight filter through the glass. The city was still buzzing with its usual energy, but today, Jamal had learned something that would change everything. He no longer needed to prove himself. He just needed to keep being himself. And as the waiter came over to check on him, Jamal smiled. There was nothing more satisfying than knowing that sometimes justice doesn't have to come with a price. Sometimes it just comes from doing the right thing, without a second thought. Jamal Carter had learned that power and respect were not about money, not about titles, but about who you were when no one was watching. And as long as he remained true to himself, the world wouldn't be able to ignore him.